Rebekah Roth here again with another question to give you an answer for. Someone wrote in an email and wanted to know what were my initial red flags when I started to look into 9/11. And I think one of the very first things, besides the cell phones working, were the details in the calls made. So I want to talk about those. First off, if you missed the video I did about the hijack protocols, then let me tell you, you would never, as a flight attendant, ever call home in a hijacking, ever, ever. Because if you lived through it, you'd probably lose your job. Never. The protocol was to contact the pilots, and even if the pilots didn't answer your call, there was no protocol to call mommy or daddy or your hubby. And that was the weird thing to me, is that so many people called out at to the wrong place. And I mean the people, I'm talking about the crew members, the flight attendants. The first two flight attendants, they called the company. One called a reservations line, but what was weird about that is, if you've ever called a reservation line for any airline, you're on hold. And that's probably the last kind of phone call you'd want to make, to be on hold if you needed to get a quick message out for whatever reason. The other gal that called out, she did call the in-flight service office where she would check in. And if you watch the video about kidnapping, you'll see that's what we go to, an office and check in. So that was a little bit okay, but everybody else called home. They called their parents or their husband. It was just very strange what I started to see. As a professional, you would never do that if you wanted to live through a hijacking, if you were in a real hijacking. So you see how my mind was working. Wait a minute now, this wasn't a real hijacking. Now, this was before I found out there really were no Arabs on the real passenger manifest. So I was still trying to figure out why, if they had these 19 Arabs on board hijacking, why wouldn't they follow protocol? Why wouldn't they want to live through it? Why wouldn't they want to land the plane successfully? So there were some other things that were very conflicting. Amy Sweeney said that she was sitting in the second to the last row in coach. And she said that Betty Ong was sitting next to her. But Betty Ong was sitting on the farthest to the tail section at 3 right in the jump seat. Well, the jump seat didn't have an airphone, so it meant she had to be on a cell phone in order to make that call. It had to be on the ground. But why would Amy say that? But because Betty repeated that 3 or 4, maybe 5 times. I'm at 3 right, I'm in my jump seat, I'm in my jump seat. And again, if you missed that video that I did about the hijack protocols, you would never sit in your jump seat. We were to take a passenger seat, and there were 100 empty seats on that flight. Take off your name tag and your wings and cover up your uniform with a blanket, a coat, pretend you're asleep, leave the hijacker with just one flight attendant. Nobody did that. Nobody did that. Not on any of the flights. They were running around in the aisles back and forth. They weren't serving food, but they were conversing supposedly with each other. And again, you were told not to sit down and not draw attention to yourself. So that was a huge red flag for me. But back to Betty and Amy on flight 11. That wasn't the only thing they said that was in conflict. They said that the flight attendants up front in first class had been stabbed. Amy said a doctor was tending to them. Betty said they were calling for help, like maybe making a PA announcement asking for medical personnel, and no one was answering. Well, there were no doctors on that plane. On the passenger manifest, it would say if you're a doctor, because it's part of your title. It's like Mr., but you become doctor. Even if you're a PhD. I had a PhD come and help me do CPR once. So it says you're a doctor if you're a doctor. And there isn't any doctors on board. So why would Amy lie about that? Well, then as I continued to read through all these different 302s, which kind of continue to morph throughout time. The very first one I found, Betty Ong said 3 things that they later on were eliminated from the official 4-minute taping of her phone call. She said, "We're the first." How would she know that? They were the first airplane hijacked, but she said, "We're the first." And then she said, he stood upstairs. I still have some of the 302s that have that still in print. And then she said something else a flight attendant would not say. We're up in the air. And the only way a hijacking is going to happen is if you're in the air, because if you were on the ground, we would open those doors, pull the chutes, and send you on down to the tarmac and get you out of there. So a hijacking only takes place in the air. So when I saw that, I thought, is she sending out a message? Is she sending a message to aviation people that we would go, why would you say that? I don't have an answer to that, but I just thought it was weird. But then as time went by, Amy Sweeney said something that didn't make any sense either, because even though we now know that there were no Arab hijackers on board, she said in every version of her 302 that one of the hijackers, initially she said he was seated in 9B, spoke good English. And then as the 302s had morphed over time, she made other claims that the hijackers were in 9A and 9B, which I've done a video on. And then she said they were in 9B, 10C, 9C, and 9G. Well, there are no C seats on that airplane. And so I'm like, okay, is she sending a message? Because those seats aren't even there. There's no 10C. There's no 9C. There's a D and a G. And then you go off to the other aisle where it's H and J. So I thought, well, this is really strange, because again, if you say something and you do something from point A to point B and you say something, it doesn't change. The truth is constant. But one of the things I found was that all the details were changing, and they've really changed over time. Now, keep in mind, I didn't really start looking at this till probably a good 8 years after 9/11. So by then I had a lot of interesting stuff to look at besides the crazy newspaper articles. But let's move on to United 175. That was the second plane to leave Boston. So on the first plane, we had 2 flight attendants. On this plane, we had 2 passengers that made phone calls. You're probably wondering, well, why didn't the other crew members make a phone call like they did on Flight 11, right? Well, they didn't. But we had 2 guys, and one of them was Peter Hansen, and he was traveling with his wife and small daughter. And he called his parents. Now, according to where the government says his plane was, they were almost directly over the Hudson River and the Statue of Liberty at 8:52. So at that same time, Brian Sweeney, a former, I forgot what they're called now, radar officer. He's the guy in the Tomcat plane that sits behind the front end pilot. I think they're a radar operator or something, RIOs or something like that. But he was a pilot. Now, he was sitting on the left-hand side of the plane, and he would have had a perfect view if he was where they said he was, but since he was a pilot, he would know this, and he didn't. He told his mother on the phone between, well, roughly 9 o'clock. He called his mom at 9 o'clock. He would have been directly over the Hudson River and Newark International, Liberty International Airport. And he didn't think that's where he was. He said he thought they were over Ohio. And I'm here to tell you, if you're a pilot, even if you're a passenger, even if you haven't hardly traveled at all, you would recognize Newark International Airport and the skyline of Manhattan. You just would. Sorry, there's hardly anything like New York, New York, okay? So why would a pilot say that they're over Ohio? If all he had to do is look out, it's very obvious where you're at this point, if the plane was there. That's when I realized, oh dear, in order to make the calls, they weren't there. No wonder he didn't know what he did. But then he said something else. Brian Sweeney said to his mom, I'm going to go try to take the cockpit back from these guys. Well, that's the 9/11 or the Let's Roll story from Flight 93. Had someone told him the whole plan? Back to Peter Hansen. He tells his dad that the hijackers told him, mind you, the official story, none of the Arab hijackers, of course they didn't get on, but somebody was talking to him in English because none of the accused 19 spoke English good. And no hijacker would go back and tell some red-headed passenger with a child that we're going to take you and fly you into a building in Chicago. None of them spoke that good of English, and why would any hijacker do such a thing? Just nonsense. He also told his father that the hijackers told him they had 8 aircraft hijacked that day. They were going to be hijacked that day. And then his dad did something I still haven't figured out. His dad made a phone call to somebody down in Florida at the John F. Kennedy Space Center to tell this woman, I do have a 302 on her, that 8 airplanes were going to be hijacked, and then he got things a little confused. Peter Hansen was on United 175. He told whoever this was at the JFK Center that Peter was on Flight 11 from United. Flight 11 was American Airlines. Now, apparently he didn't know where his son was. I don't know, Peter didn't tell him, but Peter also said that they used mace on the plane, and unlike Betty Ong, he's sitting back at like row 31. He says all the people sitting around him are vomiting and having a hard time breathing and getting sick, but not him. That's all the people around him, which made it sound like he wasn't on a plane at all. There was a lot of things that just don't make sense if you really look at them. So let me see what else I have here. Let's go to the next flight, Flight 77. Now there we had 2 flight attendants, and we had 2 passengers. Now we got one of each. Kind of a little cute pattern going on. The flight attendant called her parents in Nevada. And what's really weird about that, according to her parents in the FBI 302 that they gave, the interview, Renee told, there was some man on Renee's plane telling her phone calls, who to call at American Airlines. They gave her 3 or 4 different lines to call at American to tell them they've been hijacked. Well, Renee failed to describe the hijackers, and she said there were just 3 of them. Whoopsie. She had the story all wrong. But she called her parents in Nevada, of all things. Of course, they didn't know what to do, but she told them, here, I'm going to give you these numbers, write them down and call these numbers on American Airlines and tell them what flight I'm on, and then we're hijacked. If she had a phone number for American Airlines, why didn't Renee call herself? I mean, seriously, why would you take the chance that your parents would be so upset that they would call and not know any of the details? They don't know the code words. They don't know the language. Where she could have just called directly. And let me tell you this in case you don't know. Every flight attendant has a phone number memorized, and it's the phone number to crew scheduling. Crew scheduling are the people that know exactly where you are at all times. Because if you have your spouse dies or your parents die or somebody calls the airline and says, I need to get a hold of Betty Ong, I need to get a hold of Amy Sweeney, there's been a death in the family, the crew scheduler will know exactly where you are. And then they can even contact the airplane through ACARS if there's a family emergency or what have you. So, needless to say, they weren't following protocols. And by the time I got to that flight, the 3rd flight, Flight 77, the other person who called, Barbara Olson, well, according to this story, remember, her husband was the George W. Bush's Solicitor General, like a Attorney General kind of guy. He was a government person. According to his story, And by the way, this happened on his birthday. She had changed her flight plan to be gone, I guess, on his birthday so they could have breakfast early in the morning together. She was supposed to leave on a different date, but she ended up leaving this day for some other reason, I'm pretty sure of that, but I digress. He said she tried to collect from a cell phone and then collect from an airphone. Neither one of those things were possible. But when it got to the Zachariah Moussaoui trial, she didn't make any phone calls. None of them connected, according to the FBI. So we have to ask. Now, Ted went off on the CNN, and he was talking about all these collect calls and this and that and all the details. And she said they'd been all moved to the back. She'd been a first-class passenger. She said, "What shall I tell the pilots?" Well, Ted wasn't a pilot himself, so that's kind of crazy. There's a lot of interesting stuff around her, too, but her phone calls didn't even make it into the 20th hijackers trial. None of them connected, according to what they said. Then on Flight 93, we had 2 flight attendants call out again, and neither one of them followed hijack protocol. They both phoned their husbands. And again, that's the worst possible thing you could do, especially if your husband didn't know how we handle the media. And how's your husband in, I don't remember, he was in Florida, I think. How's he going to help? How would your husband help you? You're on a hijacking. She got the number of hijackers wrong. None of the flight attendants that called out described what they looked like. Now that's kind of an important thing. And they all failed to do what they should have done. And so I found that was kind of interesting that Sandy Bradshaw, her husband was a pilot. He should have known the protocols, right? She calls and says, "Honey, have you heard? We've been hijacked. We've been hijacked. We're going to go up with a cart full of coffee pots full of hot water. We're in the galley now, on the aft galley, filling them up right now, and we're going to go and we're going to take the plane back." And it's just all this drama. Well, he knows, obviously, if you followed me along, the flight management computer is in the cockpit on the floor, so no, you don't put pots of hot water on it, no, unless you really want to crash. And so CeCe Lyle, she called home, and she called twice. Once because her husband was a police officer like she had been. She called and left a message on her answering machine, which we used to have then. "Oh, honey, I love you. I just want you to know we've been hijacked." And she has this little loving thing. And then when she calls back, he answers the phone. And she's so knows she's going to be dead, according to her voice, you know. "Oh, honey, I hope I see you again. And tell the boys I love them." And blah, blah, blah. And before she hangs up, a woman's voice says, "You did great," in a kind of a whisper. Now, some people think they said it's a frame, but that's not what she said. She said, "You did great." She was actually being coached to phone home, making her second phone call. And at this time, I think CeCe had probably seen that she probably wasn't going to make it, because a flight attendant is trained to survive a hijacking, and that all of you passengers survive too. And when we get on the ground and we get the hijackers taken care of, taken down, whatever, masking tape to a seat or whatever we do, shot, whatever happens, then we're the heroes. Not when you have an aircraft full of dead people. That's not a hero. And I found that it was interesting that the media turned everyone into heroes. And it's another interesting thing about the 2 flight attendants that called on Flight 93. This was very late in the flight, like just moments before they supposedly pushed the cart into the cockpit. And according to the National Transportation Board, the government story, I'll just say, because I have all their accident reports and everything, they claimed that airplane had gone from 40,000 feet down to 20,000 feet during the time all these passengers I'm about to talk about were making phone calls. If you drop out of the sky 4,000 feet a minute, you're going to be scared to death. Okay? Nobody ever mentions in their phone calls, and there's like, nearly a dozen phone calls being made, that like we're crashing, we're going out of the sky, we don't know what's going on, oh my gosh. And also when you descend that quickly, that rapidly I should say, it's very loud. The airplane is doing a lot of different things, and there's a lot of wind going by, and it's a situation. There would be screaming, there would be people in just in chaos. They wouldn't be sitting around like one man who received a phone call on his message recorder at home said, well, it sounded like my wife was just coming home with a pizza for dinner. There was no sound of engines. Now, I just heard a couple days ago President Trump, gotta get Bush era out of my head. President Trump, he always goes back and talks to the press. And we're talking now, this is 2025. We have much better microphones, much better systems for audio and visual, etc. And so they're taking pictures and video with their phones and that sort of thing. And you can hear the sound of the jets. Now, that's on a very nice 747 that's just traveling along. And one of the things that everybody that received calls from Flight 93 said is they heard no commotion, they heard no engines, the sound of the jets. It just sounded like they were in an office space next door. And so that's kind of telling as well, because if you ever received a phone call from somebody that's in an airplane, even today, you definitely hear the engines. And so let me just touch on some of the crazy, weird things of the people that did make phone calls. Besides that information where people said they were so calm and collected and they didn't hear any engine sound, there was no screaming. But a guy called, and this is kind of funny because his mother was actually a flight attendant for United. A guy named Mark Bingham called to his aunt's house where his mother was staying. And when his mother got on the phone, he did something nobody would do. None of us would do this. Hi, Mom, it's Mark Bingham. First and last name. Now, if my kids did that to me, I would like, what? And I think every parent would probably respond the same way. And then he said, I'm on a plane that's been hijacked. We're up in the air. We're up in the air. You do believe me, don't you, Mom? And at that point I said to myself, no, I don't, Mark. I do not believe you. And probably your mother didn't either. So it's kind of interesting because the first guy that called out, he called out at 9:27, but the government says the plane wasn't hijacked for 1 minute later at 9:28. And his name was Tom Burnett. And Tom Burnett's wife was a flight attendant also. Imagine that. And she was home on medical leave, or maybe she just retired recently, but she still had her training. And as I've told you, in our hijack training protocol, we were to sit down and not draw attention to ourselves, hide our uniforms with a blanket or a coat or something. So grab a passenger's coat, didn't matter. Don't look like a flight attendant. Sit down and do not draw attention to yourself. So when her caller ID shows up, now years ago for you youngers, we had landlines, and on the landline, well, we had phones that eventually did this, but we had a little box that would say the caller ID, and on her caller ID it said Tom's cell phone calling. So she knew she could pick it up. And that told her, because she was a flight attendant, that Tom is not in an airplane because he's on his cell phone, because they don't work, and she knew that. And so when she says, Tom, are you okay? He says, no, I'm on an airplane. We're up in the air. I'm on such and such a flight. And they had 2 small babies, so the fact that he didn't let his wife know what airplane he was on, I thought was very odd for a spouse to do. And also the fact that he wasn't flying on Delta, which was probably where he could get a great discount, being the fact that he was married to a flight attendant, but I digress. He was on United Flight 93. And then he tells her that there's hijackers on board. They've stabbed a guy. And he ends up phoning her like about 4 times, 3 or 4 times. The official story, they can't get it straight. So I'll tell you 3 or 4 times because that's what you find out. And she tells him, Tom, sit down and do not draw attention to yourself. Word for word, the FAA hijack protocol. Tom, sit down and do not draw attention to yourself. And he's like, no, I'm going back up there. And he's running back and forth in the aisles giving this information. So that's kind of crazy too. And the other people that called, there was one woman, I've forgotten her name, but she called on a cell phone, and there was a lot of cell phone calls made actually. Jeremy Glick, let's just say this, Jeremy Glick called from his cell phone, even though the FBI later changed their story in the 302 to an air phone. Nope, it was a cell phone because his mother said it said so on their caller ID. And these caller IDs kind of threw a monkey wrench into the official story because it said they were calling from a cell phone. And cell phones didn't work in 2001 at altitude. They still don't unless you're on a specially equipped aircraft. So this other woman, she told the person that she called, that she had just been visiting, they're going to kill us. And so by this time, this is now the 4th plane to come into Westover. She more than likely saw something that indicated that they were not going to live through this. She was certain that they were going to get killed. Another woman called and she just wanted to tell the people on the other end where the key to her safe was and the important paperwork. Obviously, she knew she wasn't going to live through this. So there's a lot of very telling details, but when I read through all of the details of all of the phone calls on Flight 93. Now remember, Flight 93 took about a 40-minute delay in traffic leaving Newark. So it kind of threw a little monkey wrench into the program because they were late leaving. They should have left at 8 o'clock as well, and all of this would have been going on in the same time, at the same time pretty much, but they were late. So it was kind of interesting that there were so many conflicting details from all of the phone calls that were made from Flight 93, that it told me that this was done to really grab all of us in the audience there emotionally. Most of these were, honey, I love you type, am I safe, I'm not going to make it, they're going to kill us. Nobody described the hijackers except for Jeremy Glick, who was a 6'4", 225-pound last-minute passenger judo champion. And he told his mother or mother-in-law that they were Iranians and that they had red bandanas on. Now, I don't know if you know any Iranians, but I know people that are Iranian that could walk into a Mexican restaurant and the Mexicans at the restaurant all thought they were Hispanic. So I don't know how you would think you would tell that. But Jeremy Glick ended up being kind of a Zionist character as well, and I'm sure there'll be more information coming out about some of these people, because the last minute passengers that got on that flight, there were 16 of the 32 or so passengers were last minute additions, and they all have a very interesting story. And I'll do a more in-depth video on the connections of all 4 flights of the people, the crew members, and the passengers who weren't supposed to be there but got a call up, most of them the day before, and most of them changed their flight the day before to be on these flights for a specific reason, because remember, there were no Arab hijackers on board. And that explains why Amy Sweeney said he spoke, 9B, spoke really good English. And that Peter Hansen said they told him they were going to fly to Chicago and fly him right into a building. Now, in case you don't know this, the Sears Tower was supposed to have been hit. They evacuated it because they got some kind of hint that that was the target there in Chicago. And so somehow Peter Hansen kind of seemed to know a little bit about this too. And maybe there were going to be 8 planes, we don't know, because they were pretty quick to ground things. And another interesting phone call that was made off Flight 93 was that of a Oracle employee by the name of Todd Beamer. And part of his interesting story is he claimed he couldn't activate the airphone, so he called the GTE operator. She offered to connect him to his home phone, and he said no. Now, maybe this husband realized that his wife could tell if he wasn't being honest. I don't know. But I thought that was very strange of a husband to turn that offer down. Basically, it was a free phone call because he, I guess, hadn't swiped his credit card. Maybe he did to get into the operator, but she was like, no, I'll connect you to your home phone. What is it? And he's like, no, 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 no. So there's this whole story about him doing the Lord's Prayer with his phone operator, and they were on the phone for quite a long time. Now, here's another problem with the official story. The Let's Roll story, well, that came from Larry Ellison, the CEO of Oracle, and it was released 14 hours or so before the FBI released that story. I wonder how Larry Ellison knew about this whole Let's Roll story. Was he a script writer? Was somebody else he knew in Israel a script writer? He's very involved with Bibi Netanyahu and Israel. So anyway, let's get back to Todd Beamer, because the Let's Roll story, the team was, I think, Mark Bingham. You do believe me, don't you, Mom? I believe he was a rugby player. He's 6'4", 225 thereabouts, maybe a little heavier. We had the judo champion, 6'4", 225, judo black belt, college level. We had Todd Beamer, a very athletic young 30-something. Let's see, who else did they? There's a few other people. Most of them made phone calls. Probably Tom Burnett, because they were all heroes of the Let's Roll story to go into the cockpit with the cart and the hot water. But here's the problem. All of those people were sitting way far away from each other on telephone calls to someone on the ground. None of them were creating the, hey, I know, let's go take over the cockpit. Second of all, flight attendants don't normally allow you to partake in an incident like a hijacking unless you're a crew member riding a pass, because you're not insured and you don't know our protocol. You don't know the code words we would be using. You don't know the weapons we have around the cabin. So I found that was very odd. I know everything about the 9/11 story is a bit odd, but hardly anything's more odd than Todd Beamer's reaction. I just can't imagine someone who is offered a free connect to your home phone. Let's get your wife in here so you can say goodbye. You could do the prayer with her. And he's like, no, 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 no. Don't want to do that. Here's another interesting thing. Todd Beamer had a cell phone with him. And that cell phone continued to receive phone calls for about 8 hours after the crash. No explanation. It's one of those things, just never talk about it. There's a lot of interesting things about him. His wife got a huge book deal written by somebody else. Well, what would she know? She knows less than I know. She probably hasn't even read all the FBI 302s. But she created a book, or someone created a book for her. She got a big book deal. These are multiple $million deals. A lot of the wives of the heroes that are dead heroes, got really big deals, book deals. They also got huge insurance payouts from the airlines and from the government. And you have to ask yourself this: if our government wasn't involved, why would our government pay $2, $3, $4 million to the victims, whether they were in the towers or in the planes? What business is it of our government? Is that some form of guilt? is tell us they were involved? Because normally in a hijacking or airplane incident, the airlines and their insurance pay out, but not the government. So I always thought that was very weird because it's very abnormal. And so I think that's it